燃え上がれガンダム。Welcome to Weekly Suit Gundam, the special bonus podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wacky and wonderful world of Mobile Suit Gundam. Another week on our Origin train, watching through each episode of the Origin OVA based on the manga of the same name by Yoshikazu Yasuhiko. And we are today talking about the final episode of the Mobile Suit Gundam The Origin OVAs, which is The Rise of the Red Comet, Episode 6, the finale of Origin and of the Loum arc. And this is a pretty fucking good one.
It's startlingly good. I had always remembered liking it, but I think in my memory, Episode 5, which we gushed about last week, maybe overshadowed it a little bit, and I'd forgotten how good this one is. And I will say, of the 6 episodes of Gundam The Origin, this one raised in my estimation more than any other going back and doing this series again. I think this episode, in some ways, has the hardest task in front of it because it's the same plot as this stretch of the manga largely, but the manga, it doesn't end here, obviously. It's just the end of the flashback, and then you go into the story. The end of Gundam The Origin is the end of Gundam 79. So how do you create a final chapter of the Origin OVA that is a satisfying wrap-up to this 6-episode project? And I think they make some very key creative choices in terms of what they emphasize, what moments they play with, what they do in terms of, I think, just kind of genre structure that makes this episode, one, just ludicrously entertaining, and two, pretty thematically hard-hitting. And I think it's a fantastic closing episode.
Yeah, I think there's some elements of it that I'm not totally in love with. I think there's like a couple of scenes in this section that I think are a little bit kind of weird, but most of them are actually kind of from the manga. And it's not really like this thing's fault. Like there's some of the stuff with like Char and Revil. I've always found that sequence kind of a little bit strange.
Oh, I fucking love that scene. That's one of my favorites in the whole thing.
We'll get into it, but overall, it's an interesting thing of as you say, trying to find a way to bring, as a prequel, it is bringing everything up to the doorstep of where Gundam begins, but also for this OVA project, it has to be the end of the story that this is telling, and it's kind of almost like serves as a coda for the whole story that has been told so far, because it's not like, like Char doesn't have a big crazy character arc, Sayla doesn't have a big crazy character arc. It's a little bit like the previous episode in that it's more about the larger scope of what's going on in the war, but finding a way to sort of narrativize that and have the beginning proper of like the 1 year war as we understand it from the original Gundam, feeling like it is this kind of like epilogue of this origin story we have been following along for these episodes. I think that it's a pretty interesting approach to that story.
I love it. I think there's two key things for me that make this work so well. One is, I think, just the command of like genre and tone and production of this episode. You have the first 20 minutes of this thing are this sort of blistering naval war in space. And I think it's maybe the best space battle fleet Gundam has ever delivered on screen. It's like phenomenally well done. It gets both this is the first big space battle in the history of the Universal Century, but also it still has that kind of grounded quality where it's very clearly built on like naval warfare, and then the mobile suits come in and changes everything. It's very cool. And then the last hour of it is basically like a spy story. I joked that it's Tinker Tailor Soldier Gundam, and it does kind of feel like that at moments. That's one of the things I love about that Char scene. There's a lot of stuff with Kycilia. It's very like espionage and politics focused, and I think it's just so good. But I think the other side of the coin that really makes this episode work is that I think this one really zeroes in on this thematic idea that has been here through all 6 episodes, but I think gets underlined here more. And some of this is from the manga, some of this is how I think they've chosen to intercut some things, which is that this war continues and expands because humanity wants it to continue and expand, which leads to this blistering line from Mirai's dad late in the episode that is one of 2 sort of thesis statements that I think this episode has, where he says humanity hasn't seen how far they can take this yet. And this is an idea I think lesser Gundam series have played with, that like war happens because humans are just violent. And I think like that can be a little facile sometimes. But I feel like this one earns it because we've spent 6 hours or more watching this increasingly violent group of vipers and bloodthirsty maniacs, which very much includes Char, taking the levers of power and pushing them forward full throttle, and enough people like basically signing the death pact together that this thing is going to continue. And I think it resonates very strongly with the World War I, World War II point of reference the original Gundam storytellers would have had. And I think the way it builds the finale of the whole thing around Revil's speech, the Antarctic Treaty, and does it in a way where we cut to every single like major character from the OVA series so far, other than Rambaral and Hamon, who I think were wisely kind of left with their perfect final moment in episode 5, sort of implicating everyone and like bringing it all together, I think is surprisingly powerful to me, and I think does a really beautiful job with this. Again, I think a thematic idea that can be facile, but I think there's a legitimate argument in the way it's presented this story in this very historically minded lens.
Yeah, and I think the thing I enjoy about it is that I it's not just that it's that people want the war to happen and that's why it happens. I think there's a good sense of like there are a lot of different kind of ideologies at play and different people involved in it for different reasons, like Kycilia and a lot of like the Earth Federation people who do feel like they are there because they profit off of the war's continuance, and that is why they are motivated. Whereas you have people I think are more legitimately ideologically motivated, which would be Guren and Revil, who to see like what the actual stakes of the war are and the consequences of what could happen if either side wins, and like want to bring about an actual victory. And then my favorite is Degwin Zabi, who is like very naive on the side, thinking that there is actually a path towards peace at this point, when like they are so far beyond that being feasible that he is like rendered completely like neutered at this point in the story, which tracks so much with what we see in the rest of Gundam proper, in his like sort of very ceremonial role in what Zeon has now become.
Absolutely. I think this whole episode is about teeing up. Like, it's interesting because the big action climax of Gundam The Origin is the very beginning of this episode. Mm-hmm. And then there are no more action scenes after that. The Battle of Loum is the last bit of like big mobile suit action. And then from that point on, it is espionage, it is politics, but it is all building up to the precipice of the war you saw in Gundam 79. And I think that like notion of this episode being a dramatization of this tipping point moment where there were 2 roads to take and one was very clearly taken, and that is the path that everyone's going to have to walk in the original story. This is why Gundam The Origin is the best prequel I've ever seen. It is just so well balanced to, I think, lead you to the door of the story in such a compelling way on its own terms.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So there are a million things we could start with this episode. Should we just begin with the battle itself, the Battle of Loum, which we got a little bit of Char's side of it in episode 5, but now we get they focus a little more on the Federation side in part 6. I would say mainly so that you can get all the crazy money shots of people being terrified of Zaku's as they rain hell down upon them.
Yeah, because this is kind of like the previous episode. This is overall a quite close adaptation of the volume of the manga that this is adapting, which is the second part of the Loum arc. Because the end, if you people remember the end of episode 5, with Char's fantastic line about, kneel before me, God, that is a sequence added into the anime in order to give that episode like a really powerful ending. But where this starts with the fleet battle and Dozel's whole strategy of like hiding and bringing his fleet around in this single file line, and then the Zaku's flanking them, all that is stuff that happens at the beginning of the volume in the manga. And yeah, this is, I think, as you said at the top of the episode, Jonathan, is, and I would agree, the best naval battle. Like, it's like the most full-bodied naval battle we've ever seen in Gundam, because usually the naval battle stuff is stuff you get like little glimpses of. There are only a couple of series that really commit to it. Like Iron Blooded Orphans is one of the few that really shows like a full naval conflict, but in that it's usually like, here's our characters who have like one or two ships and they're fighting like a larger group of ships, whereas this is, here's two full fleets going at each other, and one is using much more creative, very desperate tactics and has their like sort of ace in the hole, the Zaku, to win the day. And then the Federation are very like stayed in like these very sort of like what feel very old school, very conventional. We're putting all our ships into this very standard formation. We're sitting back here. We don't want to like really risk anything. And like the military tactics, and this is like very echoes a lot of stuff from World War I and World War II, of where the much more like radical, aggressive military tactics completely demolish this like very, you know, sort of like peacetime era like idea of what warfare looks like, where these are all, the Earth Federation are all people who have been trained in academies completely abstract from any actual conflict. Most of them are just, you know, they're admirals because that's what their family has been forever, and like that's very much the sense you get. And seeing these like two versions of war clash, and the much more aggressive, technologically advanced one win out over the much more sort of the larger force that is more populated and stuff. It's just, I think, a very satisfying dramatization of this kind of war that we have saw multiple times in the 20th century.
Yeah, it's basically a 20-minute sequence, because this episode has the shortest recap. It's only 4.5 minutes, so we get a nice short little recap, which means this is like easily the longest episode of The Origin. It's a full feature-length movie, basically. It's 80 minutes plus without the recap. And so the first 20 minutes after that recap are the battle. So it's a solid 20 minutes of action, and it is... One, it just looks like a scene where Sunrise basically opened a Scrooge McDuck vault and let the animators go in there, because it is lush as lush can be. It is beautifully animated. It makes phenomenal use of both CGI and hand-drawn techniques all together in this. It starts with that very sort of traditional fleet battle, and there's still such... I love that it's not just that, like, they ignore the fleet battle to focus on the mobile suit part of it. There's still, like, Dozle has this big strategy of he sacrifices some ships to the Tianm fleet, which convinces them that Dozle is going to retreat. But what he actually does is he makes this circle maneuver back around to the Revil fleet, going in single file, and then he fans out, and you have that amazing first volley where they fan out and just start volleying all of the ships. And there's that great moment where you have him pass over, and Revil looks up and sees Dozle looking down at him. There's a lot of... General Revil might be my favorite character in this episode. He has so much good stuff. This is very much General Revil's episode. But I love that moment. So you have all of that kind of stuff going on, of like the fleet battle. And then I think the way they handle the mobile suit part of it, where it just slowly... Because it kind of does it from the Fed point of view, where it's slowly ratcheting up the tension of like, what's the play here by Zeon? And then, of course, the Red Comet comes in and starts blowing up ships left and right, and they can't figure out what's doing it. And then all of the Zakus come in, and you have stuff like the Black Tri-Stars cutting the Revel's ship, the Ananke, in half with a heat axe, because they fucking can, and it looks cool, but it's also terrifying. And there's shots of, like, you know, people in the ships, like, looking up as a Zaku lands on them, and you get the red eye as, like, God, the red eye of the Zaku is one of the best decisions that anyone's ever made in the design of anything. It's just a very, like, intimidating, crazy, impressive battle scene that feels like it's out of... Like, you know, this is worthy of like a Lord of the Rings or something. It's just animated.
Yeah, it is definitely one of those of where in the manga it is like, I mean, it's a pretty involved battle sequence in the manga also, but this is where, as we've seen in other episodes, like the animators really get to just kind of go to town, and they're just some like very like egregious, big, crazy sequences involving all our other characters. Like Char gets a bunch of really fucking crazy shit to do.
Yes.
Yeah, I think my favorite part is when I think it's Mash from the Black Tri-Stars has the big, like, it's a giant double-handed Heat Hawk that has two like boosters on the back of it, like it's the gun hammer that the Turn A Gundam uses or some shit, and just like it, like I like the way it's animated. Is it's kind of like the axe is dragging his Zaku with the amount of thrust, and the Zaku's thrusters are on almost like to keep it slightly in control. Like there's something of
Right.
like the sense of weight and momentum in the 3D animation is so well like studied. It's that thing that like Gundam typically does incredibly well, which is like understanding some of like the like ways in which zero gravity movement works, at least in like a movie-esque fashion, certainly like in terms of making it feel very kind of grounded and realistic in the physics. And so seeing the like thrusters interplay as he's like kind of almost spinning out of control with this giant crazy axe that has rocket engines on it and barely getting it in control and basically cutting an entire ship in half. There's lots of really juicy, meaty sequences like that in this opening 20 minutes.
The big standout Char sequence here is where he notes to himself, I have 3 rounds left. That should be enough for 2 ships. Mm-hmm. And he blows up one. With 2 rounds. He has 1 round left. He uses a heat axe to make this like strategic cut, and then he fires 1 more into the engine of the ship and blows it up. And we cut over to Kozin, the guy who is one of Ramba Rowell's buddies, who sees it and is like, well, I'm useless. There's nothing I can do here with that guy on the field. And so he comes up to Char and says, hey, I have an extra clip remaining. Do you want it? And Char says, no, you should focus on your own glory. And then he has this amazing line where he says, work hard enough for the lieutenant who was unable to join us, and flies off, reminding you that Char, among many other things, is a petty bitch.
Yes, yeah. It's like Char's... Yeah, he both like gets to put in his little snide remark, and it's the way in which he's like, I could go take out probably some more ships. I don't even need this fucking rocket launcher. Is part of the implication there also. That is, yeah, fucking hilarious. This is just the happiest we have ever seen Char in his entire life. Like this is where we get the like, you know, when we talked in like during Zeta Gundam and stuff with his Quattro Vagina persona, of how much like this is the person that Char wants to be 100% of the time. This is what he loves doing. He loves being in his big fancy ridiculous red robot with its big fucking unicorn horn and flying around and doing crazy shit. And it's just, he loves living on the edge, being this kind of like, the Red Baron soldier ace type character. And this is just what he wants to be in life. And it's like it's something I think that captures so much about his character here is the sheer amount of joy he has in inflicting his like power and mastery over all these other people.
I mean, I think it's it's an unspoken thing that is in this episode, is that this is like the peak moment of Char's life.
Yeah.
Because right after this episode ends, he's about to be humiliated over and over and over again and lose his position in all of this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And go down a very different path. But at this moment, he is on the top of his own fucking world, and he could not be happier. You have all those amazing shots of him zipping through the sky as the Red Comet. You have the black tri-stars being the ones to sort of give him his name of like he looks like a red comet up there, yep. While they're all mad at him because, but goddamn it, he's so good. They can't hate him too much. It's amazing. But I think I like that it's not just Char. I like that you get MASH doing the thing with the fucking heat axe. It's there's so much good stuff.
Yeah. And then also amidst the sequence, you have a little stuff with Ryu, our
I wanted to talk about that. Yeah,
wayward pilot from original Gundam who is here at the battle. This is all stuff that's in the manga as well. That he actually is the person to discover that that Dozo's fleet has actually flanked around to Revil's fleet, but can't get back in time. And there's a lot of good stuff of kind of seeing the beginning of the fight from his perspective, and then him trying to dock and not being able to, him being like flung out into space where he has this like realization that I think like I don't know if I really love the full way that the anime portrays it, because I think some of like the way it's performed, it's very different to how I kind of read the lines in my head when I was reading the manga. But of him floating amongst this debris, basically calling himself like, oh, I'm just going to be another piece of trash in the pile out here in space. And him floating like that for a while, and then like slowly crawling back the will to like live and try to fight and trying to get the dude with the glasses. But I like Ryu's role in this as just like kind of this POV from the Federation side, seeing how immediately out of control the battle goes, and how like overpowered the Federation is as soon as the conflict starts.
Yeah, I like those scenes. I think it's something that works much better in the manga because Ryu... I mean, one, this is a rewrite of Ryu's backstory because Ryu was not initially at the Battle of Loum, and I actually was watching some of First Gundam last night. He's someone who has only ever done 2, simulations, is what they say in the anime. So, like, this is different for him. In the manga, though, Ryu overall is beefed up as a character in a lot of ways. Like, they beef up his relationship with Hayato, they do a lot of stuff. They make him a little more experienced so that when you get this in the Origin, it makes more sense. It feels more seated. It felt a little out of the blue when I first watched it 3 years ago. It still feels a little out of the blue now. And like it being Ryu, I think the voice, it's a recast again. It's a guy named Miyu Tanaka does this. And I think he's a younger actor, but he does this like kind of, I think the voice he's trying to do for Ryu makes him sound weirdly old. And so like almost like it would be Ryu's dad here or something. Like I think it's a little off. And overall, I just think the scene, it feels like a tiny bit of a non sequitur. Whereas like I think the OVA might have been better served here just having an original character here who isn't someone from First Gundam, because I think it distracts a little bit when there isn't that, like, the ties in the manga to kind of, like, seed it in there. I don't know. That was kind of my feeling. It felt much more natural to me reading it in the manga than it does watching it in the anime.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. That, like, I like the dynamic, because also, since in the manga, there's not as much of the like big crazy battle stuff. I mean, there is still a lot of it, but since it's not animation gets to like really go over the top with some of that stuff. There is more of a sense of you seeing a lot of the battle basically from his POV. That works like that in the manga. And then yeah, again, like I agree with you with the voice doesn't work for me, and I feel like it's something where as a like cameo, the vocal performance would be fine, but in the manga, I really love the sequence of where he is stranded in space in his little monologue he has. And it just, the way it's performed in the anime, that monologue falls like completely flat for me. So yeah, I think I'm with you that it's the way it's implemented in the OVA is rough. But the manga version of that sequence I really like.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One moment I forgot to say that I just absolutely love is that when the Federation people on the ships first see a Zaku flying through the air, you have one of them looks out the window and says, "Are those people?" And then a Zaku comes up and like he sees the eye and gets killed. I love that idea. I love them, they have never seen mobile suits in combat and they go, "What is that? Are those, oh God," right? It's very good.
Yeah. Although I think that's one of those things that like the way that they've messed with the timeline, it always is like, it's hard to notice, like, does it make sense that they would be so surprised by the deployment of mobile suits since, like, mobile suits have been used multiple times in combat at this point at those colonies and stuff, and you guys have your own mobile suits in the gun cannons? There's some of that stuff that, like, feels like it feels a little bit off to me because of how much, like, the history of this stuff has been retconned, not just by the Origin, but, like, over the years with the movies and different versions of the story have always kind of changed a little bit of like where and how much mobile suits have been involved, because the original idea is that like this is basically the first time that mobile suits have ever been used in combat at all, and so it would make sense for it to be super surprising, whereas here there's something about that sequence that I like it, but it doesn't feel like it's totally like connects to the timeline we've seen as presented by the Origin with how prevalent mobile suits have already become before the Battle of Loum starts.
Here's what I would say. If it were General Revil saying that, it would make no sense because he's cued into all of this. It's a random, like, foot soldier on the ship who is probably not privy to seeing some of the other stuff, like certainly not the battle on the moon or something like that. You are right that obviously, and this would be an inconsistency even in First Gundam, that the mobile suits were used for stuff like the colony drop, which happens before Loum. So they have been out there before. But I think it gets the overall effect of this is the first time they are used en masse as an attack fleet versus ships in space. So it worked for me in that sense.
Yeah, I think there's just something about like the way that scene, like the specific wording and the way it's performed makes it feel like it's supposed to be, oh my God, they're using mobile suits. Rather than it's like, I can't believe they're using mobile suits in this way. Like there's like a nuance in that difference that for me, like it maybe kind of raised my eyebrow a bit because it just felt like it didn't fit entirely like the timeline. Because you're right, like technically a like random sailor on this ship maybe wouldn't know all that stuff, but that also is like, as like a storytelling tool, that feels like a weird thing that like have to make that mental leap of like how much would this random guy have known about the degree to which Zaku's have been deployed versus like what we have seen and how much we have seen them already be used in the war. I just thought it was like a little bit off.
Well, because after this, we get a series of scenes with Giran Zabi, one with Kycilia, one with Degwin. And I know we have sung the praises of Ginga Banjo all over all 6 episodes of this thing. I think his best work is in this one. He has so many good scenes because he is now like fully in the Giran Zabi from Gundam 79 mode, where the war is on, he's on top, and he thinks no one and nothing can touch him. And I kind of love this mode of, and I think Ginga Banjo is so good at this, of he is genuinely intimidating, but he's also a fucking idiot. And, like, yes. That is kind of I feel like that is the purpose of the scene with Kycilia, which the scene with Kycilia is obviously foreshadowing to when Kycilia is going to kill Giran in Gundam 79, because in this moment, you have Kycilia realize, you had the Great Degwin out there in front of the TNM ships, in front of the TNM fleet, and she says, what if they had decided to make a suicide run? And Giran says, I think you know what would have happened. And Kycilia pulls on the mask for actually the first time in the Origin and is like, this motherfucker. And what's great about that scene is that it's followed by this little moment where you do see Admiral TNM in the TNM fleet. He's looking at the Great Degwin. They're kind of in this standoff. And basically he's presented with this choice of, we don't know how many ships they have here, but we could probably destroy them. And then Zeon, Zoom City, is undefended. We could end the war. And they're wondering, could it be a trap? Because the Great Degwin is out here. Why would they ever do that? And it's basically a fake-out maneuver. The Great Degwin is there to scare TNM, and it works. Because this is one thing Giran is right about, which is that the Federation are cowards and hypocrites. And I think that's a good moment.
Yeah, and I think that this is actually like one place where I think the anime improves a little bit on the manga by adding that scene, because all that stuff happens in the manga except for you don't actually see the scene from TNM's perspective. You just get it all in dialogue between Giran and Kycilia, and then you have Degwin and Garma on the ship, where Garma is like freaking the fuck out constantly, and he's so hyper, and Degwin's calming him down and talking him through like the potential pathways that this could go. And he says like, but the TNM fleet is still in front of us. If they do like a kind of like a suicidal charge, and they decide to commit their forces fully here, like we could still be killed and we might lose this war. And immediately after, in the manga, immediately after he says that, a guy comes in and announces that the TNM fleet has turned around and is retreating. Whereas in the anime, they add in that little scene where you see from TNM's perspective, which I like in that it gives you that like feeling of the different perspective that the Federation in the Zeon has, right? That Zeon is fighting a war of pure desperation, whereas like the Earth Federation doesn't need to be desperate. Like if they were being desperate, they might have ended the war right there, but nobody wants to go charge in and die if they don't have to. So the Federation is like, like we can turn around, as he says, like we'll fight another day. Like the Federation has such a massive resource advantage over the Zeons that they can afford to fight a war of attrition the way that Zeon can't. So even though it is a thing that if he had committed his forces, he maybe could have ended the war there, like almost certainly the admiral would have been killed in that attack. And it's like, I don't need to worry about that kind of stuff. And I think adding in that little scene with TNM, I really like. I think fleshes out the full dynamics of that moment.
It's surprising that's not in the manga, because one of my favorite things in the manga is how much time Yasuhiko spends with some of the admirals. Like TNM is more of a character. Joaquin is way more of a character in the manga and has really cool stuff. So it's a little surprise. I forgot that isn't in the manga, but it's a very good little moment. You also have Giran with Degwin in a scene that foreshadows their scene from Gundam 79, where they have the talk about Hitler, where Degwin invokes it in a slightly different way here, where Degwin is like, all right, time to sue for peace. And Giran's like, fuck off, no one's suing for peace. And Degwin says, well, you're acting like a tyrant like Napoleon or Hitler who didn't know when enough was enough. And then Giran has this just great line where he says, the failures of ancient history offer us no lessons. And then he talks about, we're going to go forward, tada maye, maye. And Ginga Banjo is just very, very good, is what I kept writing in my notes.
Yeah, because this is where, as you say, they foreshadow that scene, because that's the scene from the anime where Degwin makes the full Hitler comparison, and Giran doesn't know anything about Hitler, and then like the end of that scene being Degwin being Hitler lost, he died, and Giran just like storming out annoyed. That scene is still in the manga, so it is also like presaging the scene quite literally. It's not just a reference to that scene in the anime or anything. But yes, I like the consistency of here Giran's sort of portrayal, and that this is where he becomes the Giran Zabi we know, right? This is where he becomes the Hitler analog fully. Of I think like it's this, and then the scene afterwards where he's giving the speech to all the soldiers is he has like fully drunk his own Kool-Aid. I always get the impression that with Giran, he used the sort of master race rhetoric around new types and space noids and all of that purely as a propaganda tool originally. And I think like slowly over time, because every time he's pushed the boundaries a little bit, he's gotten away with it, that he's become so kind of like drunk on his own power and authority that I think at this point he like has fully believes in it, and he fully believes in his own like inherent superiority and the superiority of the people that choose to follow him, whether or not they're actually technically space noids, as we'll talk about, where there's a contrast between who he considers space noids that are important, and then other two people are also space noids. It's like, it's fine if we kill people in that colony, whatever, even though, you know, there's a clear hypocrisy in that, in the philosophy he's espousing. But I think that this dynamic of him having fully taken control of the reins of power and being completely ignorant of the, like, ways in which this is basically inevitably going to go wrong, and Degwin sitting there on his throne, who Degwin is an academic, he is someone who studied history, he knows all this stuff, he knows exactly where this is leading, but he's powerless to do anything about it.
It's very good, and overall, like, and it is a good historical analog. I mean, Giran is Hitler at this point in what he is doing, in the like, the ambition is so high, it's nondescript also, right? Like, it is evil without an end point, right? Like, and this is very true, I think, in Gundam 79, is I don't know what Giran's end point is, other than, like, annihilation of all the humans on Earth at a certain point. Like, there is, it's so... And there's always another step. There can't be an endpoint for this ideology, because that ideology relies on there being an enemy, right?
Yes, yeah. So he's constantly moving his own goalposts back and back and back and back. And this is one of the things that makes like Degwin's bid for peace like very limp and like ineffectual, is that I think he's completely lost sight of like how severe it's gotten with Giran. And I think Revil is like one of the only people who kind of understands, oh shit, like this is a war we have to actually see through to the end, because this is not a war that people can afford to lose.
Right. Yeah, that's the whole... I mean, that's the impact of the end of this. I think this episode overall, and I think it's through the character of Revil and where we go with the Antarctic speech, is very good at reorienting us to the position of Gundam 79, which is like, the Federation ain't perfect, but those Zeons need to fucking lose. You know, like this needs to end.
Yeah, because there's one beat that I think we kind of skipped over a little bit in the fight earlier, and I think it's partially because I think the anime doesn't emphasize it as much as the manga does, because I think it's a really important moment for Revil, but it's when the swarm of Zaku's comes in and flanks the fleet, and Revil at that moment realizes they have basically lost the battle, and he has this line where he says, Zeon, Osorubeshi, like basically Zeon is a thing to be feared. And he says the line in that moment in the anime, but I think with the manga being, you know, just like, you know, snapshots of individual moments, there's a lot of weight on that moment in the manga that has always read to me as, like, that is the moment where Revil fully realizes how thoroughly he has underestimated what he's fighting, and, like, how severe this war actually is. That, like, this is how desperate Zeon is, this is how much they're committing themselves, and this is how, like, far they're willing to push themselves. And that I think he sees in that moment, like, oh, this is not a thing that's going to end in peace, like in like a peace treaty. This is not a thing that's going to like end in just like giving Zeon its own independence. This is not a war for independence anymore. We're so far beyond that point. I think like it's that moment when he says Zeon Osorubeshi is where he is committed to, I have to put an end to this war, because if we lose, it could mean like basically extermination of Earthnoids in like life on Earth as we have known it.
Revil is low-key, and always has been, one of my favorite side characters in Gundam, because I think he's so fascinating, because in Gundam 79, he is not a perfect man, but he is one of the few adults you meet who kind of gets it. I think you get the sense of, like, he he gets one, I think he has an actual empathy for like Amuro and friends in their situation that other adults don't have, but he also has an understanding of like the new type of it all and like what's going on, and he's interested in it. But he is also like brave and righteous in a way that you understand why everyone stands to attention when he comes in a room. It's not just out of courtesy, it's out of like he actually commands that. He has a goodness and a righteousness to him as a soldier. And I like the arc that is traced in the origin is subtle, but I like that he's sort of a background element because he's not the top dog in the military yet in the origin. Mm-hmm. He's up there, but he's not the absolute top of it. And he's kind of feeling it out, and he feels a little asleep at the helm because he's not sure where this is going. And then in this episode, you see him wake up fully until he gives that speech and changes the course of human history, right? And I think that is like, it's such an interesting, it's the kind of thing where you want to read, like, what does the biography in the world of Gundam in, like, you know, Universal Century 100, like, or 0100, what does that look like for Revil? Because he would be such a key, interesting figure in its history, you know?
Yeah, because there's something about him, that I've always loved. There's like an inscrutability to the character that, because he's always been a supporting character, even here where he's like given more focus than he's ever been given in anything else, he still is like on the sidelines. You know, we don't get like the story from his POV. We don't like see his family or his background or anything. And there's also something about his design I've always just adored. That adds to his inscrutability because he's, his face is completely covered in his beard and all that stuff. He's got this whole like kind of Santa Claus look going on. But he is the like one person amongst the Federation that feels like is actually motivated legitimately like by principle and not by greed or just like circumstance. That's something that we see consistently both in Original Gundam and then also in the Origin, where every time we basically see any other person who's like a member of the top admiralty, they always feel kind of spineless, as Girin likes to describe them, or they're there to like make a buck, and they're only in that position probably through like nepotism. Effectively, is always what it's felt, that it's this very corrupt federation that has existed for such a long time, has not been meaningfully challenged by anything in like over probably like hundreds of years, and it's just allowed to sort of like steep in its own corrupt decadence, and Revil is just this one rare man who is able to like work his way up enough to a position of power that when like this moment of history kind of like happens, he's able to use that to leverage enough power to fight, and he's like the only person in the Federation at any UC Gundam thing that is ever like that, right? It's like, it's everyone else that's in the member of the top admiralty is always like just a complete scumbag from this point on, that allows like the Titans to come about and stuff like that. And it's, like probably in many ways the worst thing that happened in the history of this world is that Revil gets killed at the end of the war, because I bet that the Federation afterwards would have been a much better place if Revil had still been there to like influence it.
I mean, he probably would have been like the Ulysses S. Grant of that world, of like, he would have become president or something, and like had the Ulysses S. Grant president whose reputation has been historically salvaged in recent years for some of the better stuff he did. It turns out all the Ulysses S. Grant was a bad president was Southern propaganda because he's the guy who defeated them. Yeah. Weird how that happened, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, he looks like Ulysses S. Grant. I wonder if that's like a conscious influence on it almost. He has that very wartime leader general kind of thing. Anyway, very cool character. We will have much more to say about him when we get to the end of the episode.
Yep.
I also wanted to talk about Sean in this moment where Degwin and Girin are talking. After Girin leaves the room, you have Kycilia come out from behind the curtain where Degwin is sitting, like she's the fucking Phantom of the Opera. She's got her stupid mask on. It's so great. Girin basically tells her like, he says he has become a fiend. No one can stop him but you. And she has this line where she says, "Your Kycilia will always be by your side." And I really like that moment, setting up this dynamic that will, eventually it'll end the war, right? It's the thing that will lead her to kill Girin and everything to fall apart, is because her real loyalties really begin and end with herself, but she does have affection for her father, even if she does not always do what is in his best interests. She's much more on his side than Girin's.
Yeah, it is an interesting, I think, wrinkle that the Origin presents, of where I think like it opens up a question of like how much does Kycilia's loyalties legitimately lie with her father, and how much of that is like a play because she likes being in the shadows and manipulate things, and like her father is a figurehead, right? I mean, that's what he is at this point in Zeon, is he's a figurehead. He's not like a legitimate political power, and that like he's not the person who actually makes any of the decisions of things that happen. That's like Gihren foremost, and then Kycilia under that. Because in the original Gundam, like I always just read it completely as like Kycilia legitimately has affection for her father, and it's like legitimately motivated to act because she sees how monstrous Gihren has become through that action. Whereas in Origin, I feel like some of the stuff, because after this point she says Kycilia will always be by her side, but then she immediately starts acting behind the scenes to perpetuate the war, and is not doing anything to move against Gihren or to end the war. That I think like adds this other wrinkle of how much of that relationship with her father is that from 0079 Gundam, or is it being sort of more reframed here as another put on that she has for like another like play, another plan, another scapegoat in manipulating her father the way she manipulates everybody else.
Well, because the manga, if you haven't read it, some of the stuff it does at the Battle of Abao-Aku, I think is really smart in showing that like she has additional reasons for wanting Gihren dead beyond he killed her dad. That is, one, I do think, like, in general, she probably does have a certain code of, like, it's bad to kill your dad, right? Like, because she is someone who operates behind the scenes in a certain way. But also, like, that is a good pretense for her to take out a gun and shoot Gihren in the head and then take command at this pivotal moment. And there's so much extra stuff done in the Origin about the overall, like, politics and strategy that you can read it one of two ways or a little bit of both, right?
Yeah, because I'll say that when I read the manga, I very much, when I got to that sequence, read it as a more, the death of her father is like the political excuse she needed to leverage that as to be able to use to assassinate Gihren, and then leverage that as like a legitimate political act, rather than it just being a thing of her like a mad grab for power, which I think it is a mad grab for power. Yes. I kind of, honestly, I don't really read it too much as of her actually having a commitment to her father, because I think there's too much that she does that clearly moves against Degwin's interests, I think, for me to read it as being she's like that she's actually by his side. She doesn't feel like that to me, at least.
Well, and this is one place where the OVA has a little bit of trouble, not by anything it does wrong, but because it doesn't have the rest of the manga surrounding it. So, honestly, because of the way the anime, the OVA calls to the 79 anime a lot, sometimes you're thinking more of Kycilia's original characterization, whereas this is all plucked from a story where, as you say, she does have a slightly different characterization in Yasuhiko's telling, which is totally fine, but it's a little more... Because I agree. I think I probably agree with you. You've read the manga much more recently. You just read it, right? Yeah. And so I'm kind of working on... There's 5 different versions of the Gundam story in my head as I'm watching this. So
yeah, because I will say that in in this OVA, I do think that like the scene that happens after this with Makuvi, I think like in the anime it reads slightly weird to me for this exact reason, because it's like the juxtaposition with this like I am always by your side, which feels like this is a thing that like genuinely 0079 original version of Kycilia like genuinely would say that and actually mean it, whereas this Kycilia, it's like in stuff that's also happened before this in the manga, as you're getting up to it, there's more that where you feel that she is very much a person that is out entirely for herself. She's just better at disguising it than Gihren is. But I think not all that characterization is like fully here yet in the anime version, so there's like a little bit of a disconnect there.
Yeah, which is and that's okay. It's a weird overall production, and like I don't. I like the version in the manga, and I like the version in the anime, and I don't think there's, like, one true version, but, like, this OVA exists in this kind of weird in-between space, which is a little inevitable. It's not a bad thing, but it's interesting. You have this whole amazing scene in Daikun Hall, which is the big location where, like, in the original anime, you have Garma's funeral and stuff, and I think this version is what Yasuhiko draws in the manga, where he's made it a little bit crazier and even more over the top and gnarly, and I think that's such a cool location. You see it several times in the manga, and I love that we get this big scene here. And this is where they hold the victory celebration, where Char comes in and is announced as the ace of aces, the Red Comet, the dashing cape of a field officer is now fluttering on his shoulders, and everyone is annoyed because all the girls are running to Char, who is very bemused, and all the Black Tri-Stars are very angry, and I think this is a very good scene.
Yeah, I love everything in this whole sequence. Like let's just focus on the Char and Garma of it, because I love
the Char and Garma
interaction.
So
because you also there was a brief scene earlier where Garma is in an argument with Dozol, and Garma wants to get put into the position that he eventually is put into, which is he is part of the Earth invasion forces, and so he's part of like the land troops or whatever that are going to do a colony operation, and then after that he will be put onto Earth. And so he's been put into a position that he actually wants to be, that will allow him to gain like legitimate military prestige through his own accomplishments, which is what he wants. They can compete with Char. And then at the party, Char is there getting fawned over by like every woman basically at the party, and then Garma walks up. And I love the way the anime does it, of where there's all these women around him, and then Garma walks up, and just like I rewound and watched the scene like 3 or 4 times just to watch the expressions on all the different background characters. Of like, it basically feels like all those women are like secret like otaku ladies that like totally ship Char and Garma also, because it's like they're all sit back watching this conversation with utter fascination on their faces, because it's like, because they realize that the one true ship has arrived and they're not a part of it, and they just get to like sit back and admire as Char and Garma sort of spar with each other. And Garma bragging about the fact that he's going to be on Earth, and I've got my entire command under me, and Char saying it's like, it's going to be like dirty and bloody work, not fitting like a young a rich boy like you. It's just, that whole scene I think is just fucking fantastic.
It's a fantastic scene. It's great in the manga, where you have this amazing panel that it's almost a full page panel that ends of the two of them looking at each other longingly. Garma with his like has to look up at Char a little bit because Char's taller, and Char's looking down in bemusement, and they're both holding a drink, and the anime has a fucking field day with that panel, turning it into like 10 different shots of them looking at each other, and just the expressions on their faces are so good. In the anime, it really does feel like a missing scene from First Gundam that we didn't see, of the two of them having their fun verbal sparring, but now with the full context the Origin has given about how they got to that point. And it just, that's one of those prequel elements that just adds so much and fits. You don't have to adjust anything about First Gundam. It just slots right in so perfectly to everything First Gundam does with those characters,
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that the anime version does here as well, where I think it adds a bit more sort of like direct foreshadowing into, because it's, again, the positioning of all this stuff is different, because in the manga this is after Garma has already been killed by Char, whereas in this anime version we're seeing it entirely as a prequel. So they add in a little bit more of like kind of shots that feel like is clearly foreshadowing Char thinking about killing Garma. In particular, they put a really good one on Char has a line where he says it's a dangerous assignment. And the shot of him in the anime as he says that is him like kind of looking down on him at Garma with like a slight smirk on Char's face that basically looks like the expression he has when like he fucking does the pettiest thing Char has ever done in Gundam, which is unplugging the communications cable, and like him just sort of like looking down at it and smirking as Garma's like desperately trying to call in and get reinforcements. And they just like animate him to like kind of make that more of a direct foreshadowing or kind of call back to those elements, and I love that. Like, I just love how petty and fucking how Sharma this scene is. It just encapsulates everything that's fun about their relationship dynamic in this one dumb party scene.
I don't know how the Gundam Cafe in Japan never had an item on its menu called shawarma, which was shawarma, but it's like it's like a bunch of like pieces of chicken in the sauce, like in the shape of Char and Garma and a heart together. It's shawarma. Oh, they're so good. I love it. This whole scene is great. I love that like it's just low-key playing some Beethoven in the background of this scene, because all the Zeon nobles like to pretend they're so high and mighty, you know? Original Gundam 79 would do some of the like kind of fake classical in some of those scenes, so I think it's very funny. Yeah.
And then the other side of this scene is Girin, like through all of this stuff, Girin is giving this speech that is his full-on Hitler master race speech, right?
Yes.
Like, this is where his rhetoric has completely turned to, we are the space noids, we are the people who are, like, inheriting the will of Daikun, we are, like, the superior race, and we must like wipe out basically the people on Earth, and bring about like a true and ultimate victory. And I think the one thing I think the anime is, with its editing, able to put an even sharper point on this, is that entire speech about space noid superiority is immediately juxtaposed with Garma being sent to this one of the other colonies at Loum that has not been totally subjugated yet, and going into the colony with a fleet of troops and like some Zakus and tanks and stuff, and just killing people. And just basically massacring what little like kind of guerrilla resistance is there in a bunch of the citizens, and you just see a bunch of like innocent civilians running away, trying to escape, many of them getting killed, and like the immediate, you know, hypocrisy that's drawn there, which is true of any of these kinds of fascist ideologies of like the master race or whatever, is that those lines that are drawn by that ideology are completely arbitrary, and they extend as far as the whim of the person who is drawing them and using it as a propaganda tool. And so, you know, the immediate contrast of, we are like the superior race, we're the space noids, like we are better than anybody else. Anyways, now we're murdering a bunch of other space noids over here, and let's not think about the hypocritical elements of that in our own ideology. Like, it's a very, I think, like, sharp and very powerful juxtaposition.
Oh, absolutely. There's some astonishing shots of like civilians running away with the, you know, shell casings from a Zaku falling down, a la very reminiscent of the obviously famous moment in F91 where one hits the woman on the head, because it almost happens here. And you have Garma, just he's a, I don't know if Garma has any actual ideology, but he is full on with this because, hey, he's finally getting some glory, and it is a gross scene, but that is where Garma has made his bed.
Yeah, of where he is like no longer thinking of the people he's fighting as people, right? He's in the like they are the enemy mode, and they're just like an obstacle that must be tread over in order for him to get like the success he wants. And like this is like the last of that, right? We have seen that happen with like all the kind of major characters on the Zeon side bit by bit. Like we had that with Dozel in his like, you know, big like dramatic scene of him realizing the horror of what he's done, and then the only way to survive it is to rationalize it and then not care. And we see that echoed at the end of the fight in this episode, and now we see that exact same rationalization happening to Garma, that he wants glory, he wants fame, he wants to perform and like reflect well on his family, and so he has kind of abandoned his like humanity in order to do that, and he doesn't seem to have noticed that that's even happened.
Nope. The final stretch of this episode mostly deals with the sort of politics and espionage around what will become the Antarctic speech, right?
Yeah.
The Zeon is exhausted speech. So you have these dual scenes that are intercut with Degwin visiting Revil in the prison and Makuvi in the museum where Kycilia comes in. Both great scenes, but I need to point out right at the beginning, the funniest thing in all of The Origin is this little bit of art design where on the prison, it's you have this establishing shot of the prison, and it says on the sign in big letters, you can't miss it, Principality of Zeon, the prison. It doesn't say like Principality of Zeon, prison. It's Principality of Zeon, the prison, which immediately made me think of things like in the Spaceballs movie where you have Spaceballs the t-shirt, Spaceballs the breakfast cereal, Spaceballs the flamethrower. The kids love that one, and I just love that idea of it's Principality of Zeon, the prison.
Yes, yeah, and that is an establishing shot that only exists in the anime. And yeah, it is very funny. The notion of like we've just got the one. It's the prison. We only had the money to build a single prison for the entirety of the Republic of Zeon, or the Principality of Zeon. Excuse me.
It's so good. I love this scene with Degwin and Revil. That we've had several moments throughout the series with Degwin and Revil where I think they sort of get each other, or at the very least, Degwin believes Revil is a kindred spirit, that they're both men cut from the same cloth, from the same generation. They get it. And in this scene, you totally get that sense of, like, Degwin senses, Revil's going to be on my side, Revil's going to get all this. Revil just kind of stays quiet, and obviously Revil is past all of this shit. Revil's not going to say anything bad to Degwin here, because Degwin's going to let him go, but Revil is thinking about how probably wants to fucking kill this guy, right?
Yeah, that Degwin, and this is, I think, just such a good piece of characterization on Degwin's part, that he is, like, he's so naive here. Like, his belief that, like, there could be a peace treaty where, again, like, let's remind ourselves that the Zeons like a week before this, wiped out half of the population of the planet Earth. It's like you're so far past the point of where there's some sort of like a normal peace treaty and we could just sort of like sign this and pretend it never happened and go our separate ways. Like, because one, Giran wouldn't ever let that happen. There's absolutely no way Giran would allow that to happen. And two, the people on Earth wouldn't let that happen. Like, even if the Admiralty of the Federation wanted it to, there's no way that that could fucking happen, because the crimes of what's been committed here and the threat that Zeon represents is so immense. But Degwin has no perspective on any of that shit. Like, he's totally lost sight of the scale of what has occurred here.
Yeah. And so this entire, like, final... It's something I love. This entire final act of Gundam The Origin is started by Degwin wanting these peace talks, and then everybody else, literally everybody, Kycilia and Giran, but also all of the people on Earth like Gop and Makuvi and Char at one point, all of them have a vested interest in letting this war go on, whether for material reasons, whether for genuine ideological reasons like Revil and Giran in the opposite bad direction, or someone like Char who's like, I don't want the war to end, I'm having a ball, right? So all of them want it to continue, and all of them take the opportunity Degwin in his naivety has given them, and they run 100 miles with it. And I think it is such a smart piece of, because it is basically like a sort of espionage politics story, those two kind of like subgenres that are kind of related put together for these last half hour, and it's so many delicious, interesting scenes to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And because, as you say, this sequence is intercut with Kycilia talking to Makuvi, basically setting up of that Makuvi is the guy who's going to go to Earth to negotiate the Antarctic Treaty, but she's telling him, it's like, but like, that's just a pretense. Like, really, you are there to set up our Earth invasion forces, because Makuvi is the only person amongst like the Zeon forces that like actually admires or appreciates like the cultural and historical value of Earth, and also is, you know, he's the opposite of Giran. It's like Makuvi understands and knows history, so he's not going to like be destroyed by, you know, losing sight of the lessons learned from that past. I think is part of the idea there, and that, you know, I mean, having immediately intercut of, oh yeah, we're going to have peace, and I'm going to send you there to have peace, and then cut to Kycilia, we're definitely not going to have peace. This is just a pretense. We're sending you there, so you're like the advanced stages of our eventual invasion of Earth.
Yes, I mean, Makuvi literally has these two questions he asks at the end of the sequence, one of which is, well, what do I do if there's no enemy to fight? And she says, and I think this is the first of two, like, thesis statements of the episodes. She says to him, regardless of the time or place, mankind has a fundamental desire for war. Whether that be foolish or wise, plans are already in motion to prolong the war. And then she also lets him know, because she says, I respect you. Giran, I find him detestable. A line that, of course, is a lift from the original series, and is delicious here.
I love this. It's like, watashi wa giren sotsu yo skane. So she says it in this very like high-minded way of
yes,
you know, the word ski, which is to like, but skane, which is this like very fancy way of making it negative. And
which is why they use the big word detestable in English. It's a good translation. Yeah.
Yes. And I like in the manga in particular, she says that line like 4 or 5 times. So she says that to quite a few people.
Yes.
And I like it every single time. It's like, it's, you know, it's her way of sort of like, she says it to anybody that she brings into her confidence to like let them know like we're going to the top, basically. Like wink wink nudge nudge, like at the end of this, we're the ones who will be in control, not Giran. Yeah, and it's good.
Makuvi, I fucking love this scene. It's very good. It's primo Makuvi stuff. In general, I guess we'll talk about this next week, Sean, when we talk about the manga. Makuvi is very true to his character from the anime, but has a very different narrative role in the manga, mainly because of how they've reoriented the Odessa Day stuff. And I don't know about you, Sean, I love the Makuvi stuff in the manga. I don't necessarily prefer it to the anime, but I do like it a lot, and I think there's some really good moments. And in general, his characterization is just so on point, and I think it extends to this scene, it extends to the voice work. I love that he is just hanging out in a museum, looking at art, going, that's fake. That's fake. Yes. I love the idea of there being a museum in the Universal Century where a bunch of like knickknacks and trinkets, like stuff that was sold at like gift shops in our day and age, becomes like they start to believe it's actual history. My favorite moment being the curator is pointing at like basically a Japanese kabuki mask or a theater mask and being like, this is Roman, and Makuvi just goes, and you know what he's actually thinking because he probably knows what he's talking about. That whole scene is great.
Yeah, because I'll say like one thing with Makuvi, because I do like a lot of the stuff they do in the manga with him, but I always, I feel bad for him that in both the movies and in the manga, his best shit got cut because he's not at the Duel of Texas, and they like the movie version, they have him die at the end of the Battle of Odessa, which like in many ways makes sense, but it's like the entire reason the Gyan exists is to have a cool duel with the Gundam, and it's just like it's always frustrating that one of the best things in Mobile Suit Gundam just never ends up getting adapted. So it's like I feel bad for him in that respect, but yes, this scene is very juicy, and I think one of the things I really love, he sort of the like philosophy he espouses that is very like, I think encapsulates Makuvi as a character as he's always been going back to the original anime, is him saying that the universal century's history extends not even a full 100 years, and that is why people mock us, like basically people living in space, that they don't have like actual history. And so he like part of his goal in going to Earth is to like accumulate that history and to like incorporate it into their own, right? And it's this like interesting kind of like cultural perspective that we don't get much of because it's such a war-focused series, and the characters are all predominantly soldiers or people who've been conscripted as soldiers. There aren't a lot of people that we encounter in Gundam that are like concerned with culture as a thing. And I like that Makuvi is the character who like he thinks about and is concerned with culture, but it's also in this very like consumptive, predatory way that he like uses it as like a weapon of like status, and wants to like possess it. So it's like he's the character who's interested in culture, but it's in this very like kind of gross, possessive way that is why he's fairly like a slimy character.
Yeah, and I will say, I think the thing that works for me about how the manga does it, and maybe this is more a conversation for next week, but the thing that works for me is that I think Yasuhiko understands the character so well and puts such a good fine point on all of that it would feel even weirder if he were still just hanging out with Zeon by the point of the duel in Texas. And so I think he squares the circle well within the specific version of the story being told in the manga, where he still gets the Gyan in there in a phenomenal little moment. And you all know how much I love the Gyan, so I'm always there for more Gyan. I think it's obviously a better use of the character than like the movies do, which mostly just cut him. Other than I think they do keep the vase line in there somewhere.
Yes,
but yeah, it's good stuff. We'll talk about that more next week. We have our scene with Char and Dozle, where Dozle officially recruits Char under his wing, which is where he is at the beginning of First Gundam. He's working for Dozle, and he is given his orders for Operation V. You have some primo Shuichi Keita lines here, like him saying, "Earth doesn't agree with me. I'm a space noid through and through." His whole like way he's kind of buttering up Dozle. It's very good. I love the little robot they have on the table that prints out the orders. Char reads them and then gives it back to the robot who shreds it. That's such a great little fucking touch. This is what I mean. There's so much like fun, like space espionage stuff here. And this is where you get the full prequelization of Char Aznable, where he is given his ship, the Falmer, a Musai that surpasses all other Musais, according to Dozle. He's given free reign on this mission, do whatever it takes to find and destroy Operation V. He gets Lieutenant Dren. He gets his whole ship and crew and Slender and everyone else, and he is off. And there's some really, really good stuff here.
Yeah, I like this stuff. I do also think it ends up slowing down the pacing of the episode a bit too much for me, though. It's like it's a little bit too on the nose prequely, of like, we gotta get every little piece back into its puzzle of like, this is where he gets his Musai, this is where he gets Dren, this is where he has the conversation where he makes Dren acting captain, and all of this stuff that's like, it's like, I guess it's fun to see, but it also just doesn't feel like it like reflects much about the larger story being told specifically in this episode of the OVA to me.
Maybe not, but on the other hand, in his speech to the crew, Char has this line, "I am a warrior of the cosmos, a knight who races at will across the heavens faster than any ship." And this whole scene could be garbage, and if Shuichi Ikeda just got to say that line, it would still be worth it. So that is my counterpoint to you.
Yeah, I mean, he does say Amakakeru Senshida, which is like, yes, the warrior who rides across like the heavens, basically, which is a very good line. Like, yeah, it's the thing that it's a little, I think that's kind of what I mean by, and I will say, like, I also don't particularly love these scenes in the manga either. I just think it's like a little bit too on the nose prequel. It's like, it's because it's not telling a story by putting these pieces in their puzzle. It's just putting the pieces in the puzzle is kind of like what it feels like to me. Like, now we're at the point where he has to get this, and that, and the other thing, and we have to see him get the Operation V orders. All things that are, like, only interesting because I like Gundam, right? It's not, like, interesting in and of itself, I guess is what I mean.
No, and I do see what you mean, that it is not strictly related to the Revil plot, although Char will intersect with it in a little bit. But I feel like it's important for the arc of this OVA, at least, to have at least place Char where he's going to be, because everyone else is. You have this, big closing montage where you kind of, have everyone in place for the events. And I think it's, I don't know. And yeah, and some of it's just the fanboy in me that when Shuichi Ikeda says Dren Shui or Dren Kancho, I love it. They picked all these names for characters that sound uniquely good coming out of Shuichi Ikeda's mouth, like Doren and Selender. It's, so I just love it. It works for me.
Yeah, I think I just would have liked a way for that to, like, more naturally fit into a story being told, rather than it feeling like it feels like fan service to me, I guess is what it is.
But it's very good fan service. Sure. So Kycilia, next we have basically the big operation, which I have to talk about this for a second. Kycilia's operation to spring Revil and put all this in motion, she calls it Operation Bluebird, which she says she has named because it's the first, Bluebird was the name of the first film made jointly by the US and the USSR in the Cold War. So naturally I had to go research that, Sean. And that is true. That is a true history fact. I don't know if it's actually the first film made jointly by the US and USSR. It is one of the only ones. I don't know if it was the absolute first, but it was a joint production of Len Film and 20th Century Fox, released in 1976, directed by George Cukor, starring Elizabeth Taylor, Jane Fonda, Ava Gardner, and Cicely Tyson. It's based on a 1908 Maurice Maeterlinck play. And it was basically a producer did this program through a UK cultural exchange program to co-produce between the USSR and US. My favorite historical detail here is that the producer Edward Lewis initially hired Arthur Penn to direct, and the Soviets said that man is too liberal, and George Cukor was hired as a non-political compromise. I found that very funny.
Yeah, that is interesting. Because one thing that's interesting is that also is an original line to the anime. That scene is setting it up isn't even in the manga. So, like, that is like an interesting little because that was one where, because I know that right now because I'm scrolling through the manga looking for the scene to look at it, because I didn't realize, because even though I just read this sequence like weeks or like 2 weeks or so before I watched the episode, that scene fits so naturally in what happens that I didn't even realize that wasn't even in the manga. Yeah. It's a very good little beat to, like, just, I think it's nice because it very, like, clearly establishes the nature of what is happening with Revil. Just like, in case someone is a little bit confused about what's happening, which is that it is Zeon people disguised as Federation people breaking him out of the prison to then take him to an actual Federation ship that is waiting, like, somewhere by the moon. And so, yes, it is this joint operation between like the two kind of like spy agencies on either side of the war in order to, like, get the war to continue. Yes.
And it actually does go much better than the actual Bluebird. I don't know if Kycilia should have chosen that as an operation name, because the movie did not go well. It was produced on location in Moscow and Leningrad, and everybody got sick. Elizabeth Taylor dealt with amoebic dysentery throughout filming, and later insisted they reshoot all her scenes in post in London. There's like all this, it was like a disaster for production. It was a total flop. Critics didn't like it. Kycilia's operation goes much better than the actual movie.
Yeah, it would have been great if, like, if it went sideways because one of the soldiers had dysentery. It was just like, oh god, I know this is just awful timing. I wish I had realized before I was deployed on the mission, but it's like, I really, I've got a bad situation going on here. So sorry, can we do this again? Like, maybe we can retry this when you're in, like, our London prison over here, because it's just not today.
My favorite detail about this movie, Sean, nothing about Gundam, but my favorite little detail is the producer convinced the USSR's production company, Lenfilm, to do the movie by promising that they would cast Marlon Brando as the main character. They didn't. Marlon Brando wasn't in it, but he promised that. And this would have been 1976. This is when everyone's trying to get Brando. Like, Superman the movie is going to pay him however many
This
millions.
is when, also, you're not going to fucking get Marlon Brando to do this.
No.
Yeah,
no.
There's no way.
So, that's my favorite little detail. A lot of lying going on. Anyway, you have this whole sequence where Revil gets sprung from prison, and then you have this scene that I'm surprised you didn't like, Sean. We got to talk about it, where Char finds Revil in space. I really love this little scene. I think it's a delicious little moment, but we can...
I think for me, it's just a little bit too much. It's like, it's a bit extra. I think it's a thing of where, you know, there has been this thing in the Origin prequel stuff of, like, putting Char, like, very close to, like, the things that are causing the 1 year war to happen. And I think it's like, it's on this line of that being like, is it a little bit too much and a little bit too much to, like, make him responsible for this, that, or the other thing? And generally I've been fine with it. This is one place where, and I think it's like how much the sequence plays out. Like, it's so much happens. It would be one thing if it was like Char notices it happening on his ship and he doesn't do anything and lets it go and has his line about, like, oh, I almost stepped on, like, the most impressive piece of political theater of the 20th century or whatever, or of this century. But, like, the whole, and he, like, they disable the ship and he boards it and he gets on and the one guy tries to pull the gun and Char, like, it's cool. It's very cool, but it's so much for this that it's like, it was a thing that, honestly, when I read the manga, because I remembered this scene and I remember feeling this way about this the first time watching the Origin, that I was really surprised that it is there in all of those elements are there in the manga, because it always felt like a thing that was added for the OVA in order to make Char more central, because he kind of doesn't have anything to do outside of the first 20 minutes of this episode. So I always assumed it was added in to give him a thing to do in the last episode of the Origin. I just, like, there's something about it that it is, like, a little bit too over the top for me and draws too much focus away from what I think is more like the core of what is happening here with the espionage and Revil and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, I could not disagree more. I love this scene. I love the overall pace of it. I love the slow build of, they're in the debris field behind the moon doing firing tests. They realize it's a real, like, moving Salamis. They're very confused. Why is this thing out here in the middle of space? They stop the ship. They fire on it. There's all this stuff. They board it. You have a lot of just good back and forth between Char and Dren. Char goes out in his Zaku. You get this phenomenal shot, this extreme low angle of his Zaku stepping down on the ship with the sun behind him. And he's interrogating them. He's like, you know, in full Char Aznable mode. Why have you snuck into the very heart of Zeon? I think that scene where the guy tries to shoot him and he shoots back, I love. Is it extra? Yeah, but so is Char Aznable. It's basically like there's this scene in Deadwood where a guy tries to pull a gun on Wild Bill Hickok when Hickok is set in the right place with his back to the wall, and he pulls so fast that, you know, the guy can't even see him and kills him. And it's basically the exact same thing here with Char, only with his, like, stupid sword gun thing he has on his hip that he never actually really uses in the anime, but looks cool. So I love all of that. And then what I love is there's this build and build and build, and then Revil enters, and Char is astonished for a second. He gets it. He goes, sorry about that, and leaves, basically. There's this great, like, back and forth between him and Revil, where Revil says, yes, I am Revil. What will you do with that knowledge? Zeon officer who is faithful to his duty. And they're, like, talking past each other, but they both know what they're talking about. Char leaves, and I think what makes the scene for me is the punchline when he says, that was a treasure ship that was far too rich for my blood. We came very close to ruining a brilliant bit of political theater. And I think that him intersecting with that and letting it go on, two things. I just think it's a great production of a sequence. I love the overall, you know, wartime espionage flavor of it with that build, and then the release when Revil gets in and Char, being Char, realizes what's going on. I also think it is thematically important that in the overall thematic tapestry of the episode, where you have all these characters affirmatively choosing to let the war go on and not take the off-ramp, that Char, being one of our main characters in the OVA, is one of those who sees this moment, and of course he is like kind of overjoyed to see this bit of political theater going on that he can step back and let go on uninhibited. And then there's a scene I believe that is added only in the anime and it's not in the manga, where he tells everyone on the ship to be watching Revil's speech, and he's kind of reveling in it. I think it works very well in the overall arc of the episode, and I just think it's a great scene on its own.
I think for me, my problem with it is like, it's just the whole, it feels a bit contrived or something. Like it's such an incredible coincidence that his ship just happens to be in the sector where the ship waiting for Revil is. Like, there's just something about that feels like there's, because I agree that thematically it's important, which is why I'm saying, like, I would be fine with it if it like was constructed in such a way that it felt more believable that this could have happened, because it just makes Char so important. It's like that, like he so completely dominates this moment, and he so eats it and owns it out of like in a way that feels like it's just given to him. And it's like, it just feels like the story is contorted in such a way, like to the benefit of Char as a character, that makes it also feel a bit like fan servicey to me. That it just like, it's not to me a believable sequence of events. It kind of breaks, I think, a little bit like the grounded political, like military realism of like a lot of the way that these sequences are constructed. And I wish that they delivered some of like the thematic stuff in a way that felt more natural to me than just, we're out here in the middle of nowhere doing a random training exercise. We just happen to stumble on this ship right when it's picking up Revil and are able to completely take control of the scenario, and then let it go on its like merry way. I think that it's like, that's what I mean by it's like a bit extra, or it's a bit too much to me.
Yeah, that's just not a problem I ever really even thought about with it. It was fine for me. Yeah. Because I don't know, like if there's a little extra coincidence and stuff in there, like I think Char as a character you can get away with that on. Is for me is like, he is a bit extra as a character. Things happen around him and to him and with him. It is also like, this is a 6-episode production where he is ostensibly your lead character. I think it makes sense for him to be a key figure in this final act. Like,
yeah, I guess I think that like, it just feels like there are opportunities to have created a moment like this, like closer to the escape itself or something like that, where it would make sense that Char would intersect with this plot, rather than these two things happening completely disconnected from one another and then they happen to intersect. It just feels like it's very rough plotting to me.
Can we at least agree Shuichi Ikeda is a fucking god?
Yes.
With every single line delivery?
Yeah, like the fan servicey elements of it, of like just Char being fucking cool as shit. Like, yes, it absolutely nails all of that stuff completely.
It's good. It's, it's extra Char. At this point, it's Char, fucking hours before the TV series starts. And I just love all of that. All right. Finally, Sean, we're going to have the entire Antarctic Treaty sequence, the final montage, the close to this thing. And so there was something I wanted to share with the listeners, and I think we might as well do it here, Sean, which is that the whole Antarctic Treaty speech and a lot of what is in these two episodes 5 and 6, and obviously what they're adapted from in The Origin, a lot of that is pulled fairly directly from the original Gundam novelization by Yoshiyuki Tomino. We've talked about these on the podcast before. After the anime ended, Tomino wrote 3 novels, Awakening, Escalation, and Confrontation, that really, it would be wrong to say they retell the story of First Gundam. They sort of like take some of the elements, but it's mainly a different story with some of the same aspects there. But what it does do, and I've said this before, is it's kind of like a lore Bible for Gundam. Like, so much of what is in The Origin, but in a lot of other Gundam properties as well, especially in Universal Century stuff, comes out of what Tomino lays down in this book. Sometimes the details are slightly different, but a lot of it comes out of here, including this entire episode with the Antarctic Treaty. Even, actually, someone reminded me of this. We've said a couple weeks ago that Sasro, the missing Zabi boy, is from an invention of the manga. He's not. He is in the book mentioned. So that is another thing that Yasuhiko pulled from the novel. So I just wanted to read a couple of pages here, Sean, and I will read just the main text, and then eventually we're going to get Revil's speech, and I thought you could read that for us. So this is a couple of pages. Will become an audiobook for a minute here, but I think it's super interesting, and if you've never read the book, maybe this will be fun to hear as we're talking about these episodes of The Origin that are essentially dramatizing this history. So, there you go. So this is on page 95 of the English translation that is out now by Frederick L. Schote. Let's begin. Warfare between the Principality of Zeon and the Earth Federation had first erupted in January UC 0079 when, 3 seconds after issuing a formal declaration of war, Zeon threw its entire military might into an attack on sides 1, 2, 4, and 5. Each side was composed of about 40 colonies, which collectively held up to 1 billion people. So in one audacious move, the Zeon fleets nearly accomplished the unthinkable, slaughtering 4 billion people, annihilating the entire Federation forces, and forcing the Earth government to capitulate. Survivors later sarcastically referred to having a 3-second warning. Obviously, that is toned down for future stories of Gundam. That's quite a bit of killing. The tactic used to destroy the colonies was horrifyingly simple. The colony cylinders had a sealed atmosphere, so the Zeon military simply injected GG gas into them. Poisonous, colorless, and odorless, it took only 15 minutes to inject 10 tons of the gas, and in 5 hours, kill nearly 25 million people. Had Zeon forces managed to continue at this rate for 20 hours, and then immediately demanded the unconditional surrender of the Earth Federation, they probably would have triumphed. But 2 factors worked against them. First, General Revil put up a courageous struggle around Side 5, known as Loum, and successfully held off the Zeon forces there. Second, immediately after the first gas attacks, the Federation government on Earth began to put up a fierce resistance of its own. It wasn't merely because nearly 4 billion of its fellow citizens in outer space were being killed. Human psychology reacts to more directly perceived danger. It was because Zeon also implemented its diabolical colony crash strategy, which consisted of maneuvering the dead colony cylinders into Earth orbit and then decelerating them until they plummeted towards targets on the ground. When the first colony fell on New York, the horrified people of Earth were driven to take action. Taking advantage of the fact that the Zeon forces required considerable time, energy, and large numbers of Zakus to prepare for such a massive undertaking, the Earth Federation forces regrouped and counterattacked. Unfortunately for Zeon, large numbers of Zakus were destroyed. For once, both Giran Zabi and his sister Kycilia were in fundamental agreement on the correctness of the colony crash strategy. They believed that true victory in war could not be achieved by slaughtering innocent millions with gas attacks. Rather, because they saw war primarily as a psychological process, their plan was to crash colonies into Earth's major cities until the arrogant ruling Federation elites trembled in fear. And to a certain extent, they achieved their initial objective. A month after the 1-week battle, as this first stage of the conflict came to be known, Zeon launched another attack. But General Revil had consolidated the surviving Federation ships and was again able to effectively resist. As the opposing fleets clashed in a fierce struggle between the Earth and the Moon around Side 5, the Zeon forces were disadvantaged in terms of the absolute number of ships, but they put their new mobile suits, the Zakus, to superb use and managed to annihilate most of the Federation ships. Revil's flagship was destroyed by a special team of Zakus called the Black Tri-Stars, and Revil himself was taken prisoner. It was in this same Battle of Loum that Char Aznable first distinguished himself as a Zaku pilot. Zeon's Supreme Commander, Giran Zabi, then issued an ultimatum to the Earth Federation government, threatening to crash Luna 2 into their headquarters at Jaburo unless they surrendered unconditionally. Jaburo was the central command post of the Earth forces, located deep underground in South America, and if it were destroyed, the planet clearly would have to capitulate. Shuddering in fear, high-level Federation officials began negotiating with Zeon representatives, including Supreme Commander Giran and Rear Admiral Kycilia, at a site in Antarctica. While most felt unconditional surrender was unavoidable, they asked Giran for 10 days to debate the issue among themselves. Without waiting for their decision, Giran returned to Zeon, entrusting the rest of the negotiations to Kycilia with the advice, "The Earth Federation leadership is spineless. Be sure to take advantage of that." 3 days later, the day before the surrender treaty was to be formally signed, General Revil managed to escape and return alive to Earth, and from Jaburo he broadcast his speech, "Zeon is exhausted."
Fellow Earth Federation citizens, fellow survivors, I appeal to you all, Zeon is exhausted. It is low on troops, low on ships, weapons, and even ammunition. Why then, I ask you, should we surrender? Dear fellow citizens, our true enemy is no longer Zeon, but our own weak-kneed civilian leaders. Hiding behind some notion of absolute democracy, they are reduced to absolute indecision. Why should we, the survivors of this horrible war, entrust them with the power to make decisions for us? How can we forget the arrogance of Degwen Soto Zabi when he usurped power in Zeon? He claimed that the people of Zeon are a chosen people, that we of the Earth Federation are hidebound by archaic ways of thinking and incapable of realizing the new potential for an expanded human consciousness in outer space. That there is no need for the people of Zeon to obey an Earth Federation run by outmoded human relics. Well, fellow citizens, even though I am a member of our armed forces, I have to admit that if Degwin was referring to our corrupt Earth Federation bureaucrats, he was correct. But fellow citizens, we must not be deceived by Degwin Zabi simply because part of what he says is true. Zeon may be the side farthest away from Earth, but that is no reason to believe its leaders prattle about communing with the universe. Degwin Zabi must not be allowed to justify his version of Zeon because of corruption in one part of our Federation. His words are dogma, the dogma of a man plotting a dynasty of Zabi dictators on Zeon. Even if we do the unthinkable and recognize the existence of the Zeon dictatorship, that in no sense means we must also sink to our knees before it. The Earth Federation is a government founded on the premise of sovereign individual rights. Mankind, furthermore, was able to advance into outer space as a result of the Federation government, which is itself a crystallization of all mankind's accumulated knowledge and experience. Now, Degwin's son, Giran Zabi, says it is the weak and inept Earth Federation itself that must be destroyed. Well, let him go ahead and try. Strike at the heart of our weakness. But what right does he, who has slaughtered 4 billion innocent people, have to strike such a righteous pose? Giran Zabi tells us that mankind has violated the laws of nature by reproducing more than any other species. He tells us that mankind's population growth must be managed, because mankind must learn to inhabit the universe in harmony with nature. He tells us that the death of 4 billion people was merely expiation for our past sins against nature. Is Giran mad? What does he possibly think the human race, an entire species, could gain by exterminating itself? There is nothing to gain. No. Giran is a despot, trying to exterminate the very source of life that has supported and nurtured him. We of the Federation shall never comprehend the monstrosity of his actions. And now Giran threatens to crash Luna 2 onto Earth unless we surrender to him. What basis does he have for his demands? Is he in possession of some sort of absolute truth? No. He possesses nothing more than his own demented dogma. Is the entire Federation completely enfeebled, corrupt, and degenerate? Again, the answer is no. Many good, capable citizens have fought bravely against the threat from Zeon, and we are still strong and alive. So then, does Zeon actually possess an overwhelming military superiority over the Federation? Again, the answer is no. Fellow citizens, listen to what I say. Giran's threats are mere bluff. Unworthy as I am of my good fortune, I was captured rather than killed by Zeon forces, and thus was afforded the opportunity to see the Zeon nation firsthand. I therefore can assure you that the people of Zeon are exhausted, and there is no way they can possibly strengthen their forces enough to carry out their threats. So I say to you, Giran Zabi, if you think you can send Luna 2 crashing to Earth, well then, go ahead and try.
When General Revil said this on television, it was almost as if he were staring Giran Zabi straight in the eye.
Zeon's strength was expended in the Battle of Loum. There is no way they can create new soldiers overnight, and Giran Zabi knows it. I therefore appeal to all the citizens of the Earth Federation, to each and every one of you. Zeon is exhausted. Now is not the time for us to kneel before Zeon. It is time for us to rise. Now, more than ever, is our chance to defeat Zeon.
After hearing General Revil's speech, Rear Admiral Kycilia was said to have been so enraged that she tried to smash the negotiating table. An explosive shift in public opinion occurred throughout the Earth Federation, with the result that the Antarctic negotiations concluded not in surrender, but in a treaty that merely banned the use of chemical and nuclear weapons and attacks on the transport ships both sides used to ferry critical resources, particularly helium from Jupiter. After his speech, not everything went well for General Revil. Rumors swirled of a possible demotion by the Earth Federation government, but he had already become a global hero, and there was little they could do. An opportunity was thus lost. The inability of the Federation government to come up with any bold initiatives, combined with the uncompromising stance of Zeon, led to the continuation of the war, and it quickly slid into a protracted stalemate. It was almost as if too many people had already died in the conflict, almost as if, out of resentment, their souls had enveloped the world and tried to ensnare the remaining survivors. This is a really good book, Sean.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. One, I love that Tomino is such a fucking nerd. He wrote the entire speech. Like,
Yes.
it is not an excerpt of the speech. It is the entire fucking speech.
Yeah, it's very good. Like it's very like it's very like Roman in its following of like rules of rhetoric with like the repetition of examples of three, the ways of like using humility and stuff like that. It reminds me a lot of Mark Antony's speech in Julius Caesar and stuff like that.
It's so good. And then all of those other details that are so, like, obviously there's some stuff that's different, like all of the extra gassing of the colonies, the fact that they drop multiple colonies in that version, the whole detail about Luna 2. But then there's all these little things that Yoshikazu Yasuhiko like lifts directly, like the Black Tri-Stars destroying the Ananke, the command ship, directly, and stuff like that. Like, that is where you'll get the detail that this is where Char became the Red Comet, all of this kind of stuff. It's very cool. So much of like these episodes we've been watching, the origin of them is kind of in those pages of the novel. And of course, that speech is not delivered word for word here or anything, but many pieces of it are there. And this is the center point around which this final sequence is constructed. And I have to say, Sean, I think just in terms of like virtuoso production of a sequence, this is one of the best things in Gundam The Origin is this final montage of Revil giving the speech. We cut to every character in the canon at this point watching it. You get the big piece of music that's called Future Warriors that I really, really like, where you get this big montage of everyone who's going to be part of the White Base crew, all get a little title card and everything. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's phenomenal, and it's like because the whole scene just like I think encapsulates like the full dynamics of what is happening coming into the 1 year war. In particular, like there's the two sides of it, right? There's Revil and Giran that I think are like legitimately on this like ideological fight, right? That like as you said, like Revil at this point I think like fully understands that this is not a war that they can afford to lose or surrender. Because like what that means is so ghastly and horrific that the Earth Federation has to fight. But then you also have all these people on the sides that are pushing the war forward because they profit from it. And one of my favorite moments is you have leading up to the speech on like you have some of the Earth Admiralty on an escalator coming down and they're talking about it and they know that Revil has escaped and that he's going to deliver this speech, so they know the war is going to continue. And that's where they're talking about, well, at least we can like have it be, a treaty that bans the use of chemical weapons and nuclear weapons and colony drops. And then one of the admirals just laughs and said, oh, so it's go ahead and have as much war as you like. You just have to be cleaner about it. And then he starts like, cackling about it. And it's very much, I think it captures the dynamics of what's going on here, which is there are so many people who are going to profit by the war while it wages, misery and death on the general populations of both the colonies and the people on Earth. And they just like are kind of rooting for it on the sidelines. And then there are two people at the center of this game, Giran and Revil, that are like playing for fucking reals.
Yes, they're playing for keeps. So many other people don't realize it. You have the moment where the music actually kicks in is when you have Mirai's dad giving that speech that I quoted earlier where he talks about how humanity hasn't taken this far enough. Regardless of what they say, people desire war, which is almost also like an interpolation of some of what's in Tomino's book there about like why this thing is continuing. It's not quite as poetic as Tomino's line about the souls around the body of the earth and that sort of thing. But I love that with every character you cut to, you get the feeling they all know how important this moment is. From the obvious, like Sayla is cued into it, and that's how she shuts down those assholes on the ship she's with, of like, hey, this is one of the most important moments in history. Do you care to listen? Down to like Kai, who's hanging out by the lake with everyone, and he is sort of uncharacteristically listening to this speech on the radio, and even Kai listening to it is like, this seems important. I love all of those little details,
Yeah, because they add in a little beat with Kai where he stops Amuro and like tries to get Amuro to tell him about what's going on with his dad being a soldier and all of that, which I think is a nice little bit of like giving Kai a little bit of characterization that leads into him being a member of the White Base and one of the pilots on the White Base, of like there is a more serious side to his character that has always been there, and I like that they kind of put that a little bit here in the Origin, that kind of presages his line there to his kind of like the other goons in his like biker gang or whatever the fuck they do when they're at their school with their leather jackets and shit.
I guess all those guys died on Side 7 because we never see them again.
Yeah, presumably.
Yeah. I don't know if Kai was actually that broken up about it. I actually wanted to talk about that moment. We kind of skipped over it, but the moment with Kai and Amuro I think is really good because Furukawa just goes to town on that line of like Kai kind of berating Amuro. But then I really like Toru Furia's retort where he says, like, get out of the way or I'm going to run you over, basically. He says, get out of the way, it's dangerous to stand in the street like that. And I love that you have just, like, full proactive Amuro, which is a part of Amuro's character from the beginning. You know, he has a lethargy, but also a proactivity. It's like two sides of him. You get this whole scene where he goes to the construction sector and tries to figure out what the Gundam is, and that leads to them taking everything out of the apartment, which leads to this great moment where he's back in his dad's office, but everything's empty, and they repeat the tracking shot from when he first saw it, but now everything's empty. And I do kind of like the aspect of Amuro living in a paranoid 70s thriller for this scene.
Yes. Yeah, it's a nice little way to kind of just like close off the little like Amuro subplot they've sprinkled through here. Like I think it's better done here than it has been in some of the other episodes. Like in episode 5, that sequence at the beginning felt very like superfluous, whereas here it partially because it's intersecting with this is basically the beginning of the 1-year war as we understand it, because Revil's speech is like Earth Federation is now committing to this war rather than being this sort of like passive participant that's only involved because they have interest in like basically governing the colonies because it gives them profit, whereas like now they're like, no, we're going to actually fight a fucking war with you guys, which is part of what that speech is. And so that more like I think dramatically pulls Amuro and the other characters into the action because we know where all this is going. And so it feels more like immediate and like narratively impactful to have some of this stuff here.
Yeah. And you know, I don't ever need the prequelization with like Amuro learning about the Gundam. There's other bits of the prequelization I think are really, really good. Like particularly in the manga version, just him, all the stuff of him living his life on Side 7 is very cool to see, right? We've talked about that in previous episodes. The little grace note they give Amuro, though, I really do like, where it's his last moment in this OVA, where he is kind of distracted. He looks back at the big bulkhead, where behind that is the construction sector, and he says, on the far side of that, that's where the Gundam is, and he's kind of looking at it, and there's this little, with the music and everything, there's this obvious, like, kind of call to the destiny of it there. And, again, it's not a moment I, like, need, and it doesn't fully align with like the original anime obviously, but there's something about that I just think is a nice little grace moment to like end it. And Yasuhiko has talked about in some of the extra materials in the manga that one of the key entry point images for him in being interested in telling this story in manga form was expanding on that idea that Side 7 is this weird colony where it is really there for military tests. And so half of it is closed off and it's said it's under construction, but it's a lie. And then you have this civilization going on this other side, and there's this division. And that's an image that really compelled him. And I think it's played with in very interesting ways in Volume 1, and then in some of the flashback stuff, particularly a lot of the Amuro stuff that doesn't quite make it into the anime. And I like that call to that, because it is just a compelling image of him looking at this big closed-off side of the colony and thinking about the Gundam. It's over there, and it's a good line from Toru Furia.
Yeah, and it calls to a thing that I like, that I think is very important about the dynamic of what Side 7 is. I think is like easy to forget, which is, you know, that they're not supposed to be building anything there. That it is like against the rules of war, effectively, like the treaty. Like they're supposed to be a neutral colony, but the development of the Gundam there is the thing that gets all those people fucking killed, and like the 100 or so survivors that end up on the white base, and like ruined their entire lives. Like none of that weapon development is supposed to be going on. Is, you know, effectively illegal against the rules of like engagement for the war. So that's a thing. I think the dynamic that they sort of like reintroduce here and make more like front and center is how it ties into like the different factions that desire the war or profit by the war. And some of that is like Tim Ray and the Operation V people and their whole project about designing this mobile suit is like motivated by, we need this war to happen too, because we want our Gundam to do some shit, right? We need to profit from our weapons development. We're doing all this. We're committing so much to this, even if it is putting everyone else who lives here completely at risk if we're doing this here in secret.
Yeah. So, I mean, how well for you, Sean, does this just overall sequence work as an ending? Because it's accurate to the manga. The manga flashback ends here as well, but it ends on this quiet note of Sayla watching it on the ship 2 Side 7, and that's where it ends. And the shift the anime makes is to adapt it into this bigger, more bombastic montage where you see all of the characters key to the white base. They get their little cards. Just fantastic music by Hattori here. And it is this kind of big, rousing finale. I've always remembered this scene vividly. I think it's such a good ending to the OVA.
Yeah, I think it's very good. I mean, because it's the thing where I think finding like a way to end the OVA is a tricky thing, because it's a thing that like inherently doesn't like have an ending, because its ending is, and now the TV show happens. But I think this is the construction of the sequence itself is so moving and so effective. I think that's what pulls it off. Like if it was the same thing, but it was executed to a much like lower degree, I think it would come across more as like, it's just like fan servicey, whatever. But it's edited together and written in such a way to make it feel like there's a sweep of like thematic intent and narrative drama that connects all of these people together, that we have seen those threads being, drawn together bit by bit over the course of the origin, showing what are all the things that bring this war to fruition, and how then do Char and Sayla like factor into that, and of course like it does ultimately have to need with addressing to some extent like the white base and those people and the Gundam, because that is where all this is eventually going to go.
Yeah, absolutely. It's at like at least 60% the fucking music. The music is so good. Yeah. It's one of the best pieces. I think my favorite piece in the Origin soundtrack is that Red Comet theme for Char, but I think my second favorite piece is this big, it's called Future Warriors. I know that because I've listened to it a million times. It's just a great piece of music that's like, it's the right kind of like rousing for, it's a pretty dark story overall, but to like, this big, classic Gundam story is about to unfurl, and I think it's very good. And I think the way this episode cuts to credits kicks so much ass. Where you have the Future Warriors piece wrap up with its big swell. As it finishes swelling, you cut to Revil, who has his final lines where he says, Zeon lacks for soldiers, we cannot but win. And then it's smash cut and dun 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 dun. Line Dotted Tears is a fucking great Gundam song.
Yes, yeah. Masayoshi Yamazaki is just a great musical artist. He's like a very like popular, very well known musical artist in Japan, because I've listened to some of his other stuff, because he's done other themes for shows and things like that. And yeah, it's so good. I mean, I just love his music because it's got a very like kind of classic rock kind of influence to it that's very much in my wheelhouse. But this song, it just kicks so much ass. That core like guitar riff that drives the whole song is so good. It's so catchy. And in particular, that being then put over these images of like the pods dropping with Zaku's onto Earth, and like, eventually my favorite is Garma standing in front of Hollywood.
Yes.
The Hollywood sign, which is the best, I think, addition that the Origin manga makes in taking these sort of like fake Earth locations of the original series, which has its own charm, and I love that in its own way, but making it explicitly he is in Los Angeles, like by fucking Hollywood, is so hilarious. And having that shot in the credits, while Masayoshi Yamazaki is like crooning the chorus to the song, it's the fucking best shit.
I agree with all of that. It's stuff. I mean, I've talked before about how much I love all of Yasuhiko's location work, but the whole idea of the Garma episode happening in Hollywood is something he uses. He makes such a meal out of that location. Yeah. And just having that one shot in the credits of Garma with his big goofy grin in front of the Hollywood sign is so funny. I mean, it's so many things. It's the ending with Revil's big final proclamation. We cannot but win. We must be victorious, however you want to translate that. And then it's into the guitar lick, which is sick as shit. That song it's my favorite of the 6 Gundam Origin themes. Yes. I've listened to it a million times.
100%.
It's so good. And then you have, as the song goes along, this series of what I think are kind of alternately funny and haunting images. Funny being Garma in front of the Hollywood sign. Yeah. Haunting being that amazing shot of an entire city's electrical grid going out. It's really, it kind of goes back and forth. And I think this song, there's something about it that I think kind of like is thematically in keeping, even if you're not looking at the lyrics, I just mean like the music of it is thematically in keeping with the episode of like, well, we're gonna have a fucking war, and let's have a fucking war, right? And we see the beginning of it on Earth. Also, the song makes copious use of harmonica, and that is one reason I fucking love it. The harmonica slaps. More harmonica in songs. Harmonica is a key part of rock and roll.
Yeah, because I think one thing, like, stylistically here is that we've moved a little bit out of, like, the World War II stuff, and this is very much like a Vietnam movie kind of, like, thing that it's doing, of the, like, contrast of the horror of this war with this, like, much more, like, upbeat, like, kind of, like, energetic music. That, yeah, I think is just, I'm way into, because it totally dovetails with the thematic statement of that, you know, the reason why this war is happening, or one of the main reasons why the war is happening, is because people can't help but have war because we profit by it, and so on and so forth, which, like, the Cold War is like the poster child of that dynamic. And the episode has made multiple references to the Cold War with the Bluebird stuff, that then bringing in this, like, Vietnam movie style musical montage over the credits with this sick guitar song. It's fucking great. It's something that, like, it makes me want more Gundam stuff that does stuff like this, because it's a little bit, obviously we have, like, the MS team has a lot of Vietnam influences, but, you know, it's like just such, like, an interesting, compelling kind of wartime aesthetic, that I like its inclusion here.
Oh, I love it. And just overall, I mean, this is such a kick-ass ending, from the montage with Future Warriors to Revil's last lines to the song kicking in to all of the, as you say, the kind of Vietnam imagery over the credits. I don't know how you don't walk out of this just unbelievably jazzed. And then you also get that post-credits scene, which is phenomenal, where you have the white bass rising with, at this point, just pure original Gundam 79 music. Not the original recording, but just like a very straight adaptation of it here. You have Bright. I love having Bright on the bridge here, where he's just a plucky young upstart before he has the weight of the world put on his shoulders, which we've never really seen, because Bright, by the time we meet him in Gundam 79, people are dying left and right? You know? Basically, the only scene he has where he doesn't have that pressure on him is when he gets Temray out of his room, which is, this scene sets up that he's like, I'll go get you when we land. And I also do like the captain calling him Bright Coon, because you never ever hear anyone say Bright Coon in this series.
Yeah, just getting to see that captain again is like, oh, the original white base captain, you were such a good dude. And it's like, he's like one of those guys that's just like, you hate to see go, because he's like one of the few Earth Federation people that is just like a legitimately good guy.
Yes, no, I love him. I like the last scene of Temray in his cabin. He's excited about the Gundam. There's a little bit of sentiment in that, you know, maybe he really does believe he can end the war with this. And then there's this photo of Amuro on his desk. That photo is there in First Gundam as well, but in this version it is a Yasuhiko drawing, basically lifted out of the manga.
Yeah, it basically looks like he framed one of the covers for the manga and just like put it there. It's very funny. I like it.
It's great. You fade out. On screen there is text that says, "And now, Gundam begins." And then, just to make this a perfect series, Akio Otsuka says, "Will you be able to survive?" And it's the best reading of that line in the history of Gundam, because it's Akio fucking Otsuka.
This is, honestly, of, like, all things in Gundam The Origin, there are two things that have, of, like, this anime adaptation, there are two things that have stuck with me forever, and it is, you know, it is Chara's whole thing of, like, kneel before me, God. That's one thing that I think about all the fucking time. And, like, the whole sequence building up to that with the cockpit shaking to pieces and all that. And the other is Akio Otsuka, like, whispering into the microphone, "Kimi wa ikinobiru koto wa dekiru ka?" And just, like, I remember just my spine tingling. Like, quite literally. Not as an expression, like, actually my spine vibrated. It's just like, oh my God. Because it hit, like, a chord deep inside of me that, like, honestly, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, is one of the things that I think, like, causes a chain reaction to this podcast starting, because it is that fucking line delivery that, like, I had not thought about by the time I had watched this in 2 or 3 years, about the fact that at the end of every single episode of Mobile Suit Gundam, the narrator says, "Will you be able to survive?" That was just a thing that had gone from my memory, and he says it, And like I was hit by this overwhelming wave of nostalgia when I heard that is what caused me to rewatch Mobile Suit Gundam. That then me rewatching original Mobile Suit Gundam is one of the things that got me talking about Mobile Suit Gundam to you all the fucking time. That then eventually was like, oh, we should just do a podcast on it. And is like then when I rewatched Mobile Suit Gundam twice within like 6 months or whatever. So it is like this is like getting really close to when we started the podcast by the time that this thing has come out.
So the silky smooth, perfect vibrations of Akio Otsuka's God voice,
yes,
is the direct trigger for the creation of Weekly Suit Gundam, which means Akio Otsuka is our origin.
Basically, yes, yeah, it is like it's that. Because that line delivery is so good. Like, he, like, understands so clearly, like, the weight of what this line is and what it means. And it's just such a fucking sumptuous delivery. There's so much packed into it. That, yeah, it is, like, it was that, and that feeling of, like, holy shit, I have to just go watch immediately, Gundam Daiichi ni Tatsu. And it's like, I just got to go there right now. And that's basically what I did, and then eventually we did this podcast.
I did it last night, too. I finished this, and I watched the first 2 episodes of First Gundam. Because there was just I don't know how you watch Gundam The Origin and get to the end of episode 6 and don't go watch Gundam Rising. Like, the first episode of Gundam. It is so hard to not do that. Because last time I watched Gundam Origin, you know what I did when we finished this? We watched the movie trilogy. Right, and that's where that came from. So, like, it is so hard for me not to go watch OG Gundam after this OVA, which I think says a lot about how good this OVA is, and that it's, like, fan service done right, goddammit. But, like, First Gundam is such a ludicrously good show that just, like, oh my god, I just, even in my memory, I've said it a million times, it's my favorite show ever, I still sit down and watch it, I'm like, oh my god, this is so good. But yeah, like, the best possible argument that I think could be made for doing a remake of First Gundam is having Akio Otsuka as the narrator, so for however many episodes he can say this line at the end. That is maybe the best reason to do it. Because, we already have Shuichi Ikeda and Toru Furuya and everyone else doing all their great work in Original Gundam. We don't need them to do it again because they've done it. But we don't have Akio Otsuka as the narrator. But we have this one line here. I wanted to do a
different line read for every single episode.
Yes.
You don't just do one and then reuse it. He's got to give a fresh take, and everyone is a little bit different.
Yes. Get him in that booth and say, all right, Otsuka-san, we need you to read it 50 times.
Yes.
Oh my god. Sean, this series is so fucking good.
Yes, yeah, no. It is just it's Gundam candy. It's just like it's so in my first Gundam loving heart, like it is just so much fun, and it's so interesting, and its ability to, I think, both capture and explore and build on the politics and ideas and themes of original Gundam, and then also have some of this like just complete fan servicey, have the narrator say, will you be able to survive at the end of the episode, and some of that kind of stuff. It is a true feast for Gundam fans when they made this.
It's so true. I mean, we've obviously had little quibbles along the way because we talked about every single fucking scene of this 6-episode series.
Yeah, because most of it really is, when you think back to it, other than a couple of stuff in episode 4 with Lala Soon, is probably like the biggest like complaint or criticism I have for it. I feel like most of the criticisms of like all the stuff I talked about in this episode that are criticisms, I don't think would be something notable enough that I would have mentioned it if we did we're talking about all of them in one like 3 to 4 hour podcast version of this conversation. Like most of the criticisms I have don't really rate on that level.
No, I think if we were doing the 1 3-hour podcast, it would be almost annoyingly effusive because there are. And it's the reason why we had to break it out into 6, is that every one of these 6 episodes has so many scenes that are just either such a great production, or such a great piece of story that Yasuhiko came up with, or such a great opportunity for Shuichi Ikeda or Toru Furuya or one of the new actors to like go to town with something, or such a great invention of the OVA, like the big song number in episode 5 that you have. And sometimes it's all of those together, and it really is one of Gundam's finest hours. It's, it's not in the absolute uppermost, tier with like Turn A and Gundam 79, but it is so much higher than a prequel to Gundam should be. Like, yeah, I mean, crazy.
it's the kind of thing where like it's going to be weird trying to rank it, because it is like it's one of those things where its proximity to First Gundam and it's also its reliance on First Gundam makes it like a thing that's weird to try to rate it in and of itself, because it's so closely attached to this other thing. But yes, it's something that I think could very easily, like, just the entire, like, if you take a step back from it, like look at the Origin project as a whole, it's a thing that's so easy to imagine going wrong, right? The idea of doing like for the manga, doing a retelling of the original anime stuff, making some changes, and then telling this big prequel story. Most prequels are so like either actively destructive or just incredibly boring. And the fact that this is never either of those things, and at most it's like you have like a couple of like quibbles, or like, because usually it's stuff that I'm like, I like the way the anime implies the way this went, but I also like the way that this went, and so it's like more kind of like a conflict of two different versions of the thing, and I like both of them a lot. Like the level of incredible high quality that this is in and of itself, and then the way in which it builds and reflects on things from First Gundam, is so much better than you would ever expect a project like this to be. And then on top of all that, it is also, for me having read the manga, I think one thing that's really interesting is looking at the OVA through the lens of like, how does it relate to the manga that it's adapted from, which I didn't have that experience the first time I watched it, is getting to see like how many incredibly smart choices were made in the production of this anime adaptation, and that it is this thing where sometimes it creates a little bit of like friction points where it can be a little bit awkward in the way it's sandwiched between two things. But I mean, any piece of like weird friction or awkwardness is always more than compensated by some choices that they make originally for the anime version, of being both an adaptation of this material and more specifically a prequel to the original Gundam series, that it gets to kind of like flower as its own creation, that it's not just an adaptation to the manga. It's not just a straightforward prequel. This anime gets to be very much its own thing. It's such a incredible adaptation and evolution of its source material.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think there's things I prefer about the manga, and as a whole, there's not many things I love in this world more than Yasuhiko's Gundam The Origin manga, because it is such a virtuoso piece of work in one of my favorite mediums. But this anime comes so fucking close to nailing it not just nailing it doesn't come close. It surpasses nailing it in so many ways. It works so well as a standalone anime, and it is a weird, difficult project when you think about it. It's this big flashback sandwiched in the middle of the manga that very much is there for a reason, and so there's a lot of things the OVA has to do to make it into these 6 sort of like short movie length projects, and it just does it with aplomb. And throughout, I think there is a real sense of everyone at Sunrise, it being a passion project for everyone working on this. And I think particularly in these closing episodes, Sean, I really feel like there's a kind of a sense of like, maybe this is the last time we do this. Not Gundam as a whole, but I mean this slice of the Gundam universe. Like, this could be the last time we have Shuichi Ikeda in a booth doing Char in a project like this. This could be the last time we have Toru Furuya, all those sorts of things. And in some cases it is and it isn't. They're doing Hathaway, which is more in the Universal Century Tomino canon. But, like, there has not been another big project with Char or Amuro, and this could very well be their kind of swan song as those characters. And I feel like it really feels like they went to town on making this the right kind of, like, other end of the career Gundam work for the people who are in it,
Absolutely. As well as, like, I think, like, innovating a lot of its like technical stuff with its using 3D models for the mobile suits and stuff like that we then see like that work really flourishing fully in Hathaway, as like this is like this kind of bridge to that like, not to say that there's anything particularly lacking in what they do with the Origin, because it is incredibly good, but it does feel like it is them like fully figuring out how to do the 2D 3D blend stuff that has become kind of like, the hot thing in modern animation, because we can do it so well now. That then all the lessons learned that Sunrise learns on this project, they then take and like push even further in Hathaway and presumably in other projects in the future.
Yeah, I think that's very true. It's a great piece of Gundam that is situated at this junction point of kind of looking back and in some senses saying goodbye to the past and embracing the future in so many cool ways, It's it's a spectacular thing. It was such a fun thing to get to break down. I'm so glad we did all 6 on their own.
Yeah.
This was obviously the way to do this. And it was a blast just to watch them, to talk about them, to hear listeners respond to us about them. I love this show, man.
I love it to death. But Jonathan, we are not yet quite done talking about Mobile Suit Gundam The Origin, because there is one other thing that, I mean, we obviously have spent collectively across these like probably a couple of hours talking dedicatedly about, but now we will have to do an entire episode on the manga Mobile Suit Gundam The Origin itself. I don't know how the fuck I don't know what the podcast is going to go like, because that is obviously we're not going to go one volume at a time and do a fucking half a year podcast just on doing volume by volume. We'll talk about the entire manga in its entirety, as a retrospective and kind of closing out Mobile Suit Gundam The Origin. And I'm very excited to do this, but that's what we'll have to do next week on Weekly Suit Gundam.
君は生き延びることができるか